That produces budgetary surpluses and reduces the debt. So that's the lesson that we should embrace, not the measures that the Republicans are proposing, because historically it hasn't produced the kind of growth that they promised that it would produce.
The gentleman will yield too. I'd just comment on the infrastructure piece. So here we are today with needs abound in the country, both rail, combined sewer, highways, bridges. I mean, each of our counties, you pull out how many bridges in our counties aren't up to specs. I think it's like 50 or 60 just in one of my bigger counties. These projects are only going to get more expensive.
That's right.
The energy costs going in are going to get more expensive. The labor costs are going to get more expensive. Everything associated, the materials, everything associated with what needs to get done is going to become more expensive. So I think the good business move on behalf of the taxpayer would be to get this done now, get people back to work, and I recognize that we're still running deficits, but the interest rate in which we're borrowing the money is minimal, 1–2%. So we're going to wait. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to wait. Accidents are going to happen. Bridges are going to collapse. Things are going to just need to get done. And then these local governments, state governments, federal, we're going to have to go out and borrow the money at 4 or 5% as opposed to 1 or 2. And so I think as we're thinking about this, it's not that we're sitting here saying, oh, geez, we don't have anything better to do. Let's just spend a bunch of government money. No, these are strategic investments like in Virginia. They're going to increase productivity so people aren't sitting in their cars. They're more productive, have a higher quality of life, more time with their families, all these things that we say are very important. So to your point, we're going backwards because at some point this stuff got to get done.
According to Transportation for America, there are 69,000 structurally deficient bridges in this nation. In my state of New York, there are over 2,000 bridges that are structurally deficient. In Western New York, there are 99 bridges that are structurally deficient. Every second of every day, 7 cars drive on a bridge that is structurally deficient. And as the gentleman from Ohio had pointed out, public infrastructure is a public's responsibility. It's as old as Lincoln. He called them land improvements and railroads at the time. So it's not a question of whether or not the public is going to improve the infrastructure. The question is, when does it make most sense? And we believe that money is cheap as it's ever going to be, labor is as cheap as it's ever going to be, and equipment is as cheap as it's ever going to be.
Mr. Higgins, you've raised, and Mr. Ryan, you've also raised the very same issue about the infrastructure. We can do this. We can really do it. I couldn't believe that Paul Ryan's going to introduce a budget in the next couple of days that's going to take $5.7 trillion out of the infrastructure. I often hear our Republican colleagues talk about the Founding Fathers, and we ought to hearken back to the Founding Fathers, and indeed we should. His first month in office, George Washington asked Alexander Hamilton, his Treasury Secretary, to develop an industrial plan for the United States. In that plan that Hamilton produced 3 months later was an infrastructure proponent. It said the United States government should support the creation of ports, canals, and roads. So right back to the very first days of this government, we have seen the role of the federal government in the infrastructure sector, and that is an investment. And one thing I'll add before I turn it back to you gentlemen is that all of that's our tax money from all 360 million Americans coming in one way or another, sometimes through the federal excise tax on gasoline or income tax or other taxes. If we use that money to buy American-made steel, I think that's near your district, isn't it, Mr. Ryan?
I think the gentleman from Buffalo knows a little bit about that, too, huh?
Yep,
yeah,
absolutely.
So we're talking about American-made steel for those bridges, or concrete, or other kinds of equipment. And so if we do that, we create jobs in the United States. The manufacturing sector lost 9 million jobs between 1990 and last year. This last year, we've seen an additional about 600,000 new jobs coming back into manufacturing. But if we pass Buy American or Make It in America legislation so that our tax money supports American-made products from American-made workers made in America, we can see a boom in manufacturing. Certainly going to be important in my district, and I'm sure it is in yours. Gentlemen, you're right on target here. These are the investments. These are the investments that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton said we ought to make. Mr. Ryan, I know you have a few other things you'd like to toss into this, so let's have
Well, one of the things that you were talking about, and I was just started to learn more and more about this new additive manufacturing, and there's a center in Youngstown, Ohio now that's a regional center for additive manufacturing. So the old school manufacturing is you would cut things out, and they called it subtractive manufacturing. The new stuff is a printer that you have that would be in your, like the printer you have in your office, except you pump material into it, and it just, instead of ink on a piece of paper, it's a material that would make a component part. And the cost is down now to about $700–800 for these things. So this is the next generation of manufacturing. And I bring it up because the President put together a proposal, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, to partner with the private sector to create one of these innovation institutes. And he wants to do 15 more for $1 billion. If you would see the activity going on in Youngstown, Ohio now, the companies that are partnering with us, with the private sector, with Carnegie Mellon, and it goes all the way to Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, Case Western Reserve, Youngstown State, University of Akron, Lehigh, Penn State, West Virginia. We got to get Buffalo in this somehow.
Absolutely.
But the point is public-private partnership for to expedite the development of new technologies. And the President and his team get this. And Democrats, we get this. And we got to get away from this narrative that anything the government spends money on is bad. It's a waste of your tax dollars, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's public-private partnerships like this Additive Manufacturing Institute or the other institutes that we need to create. That's the seed corn for the next generation of alternative energy, windmills, solar panels, whatever the case may be. We don't know what it is. That's why the recipe has always been invest into this basic research, put these public-private partnerships together, and magic will happen because you have the basic scientific intellect and intelligence there with partnering with the private sector who has a profit motive, and magic happens. And now we've gotten this scenario where government has no role here. No role at all. And it's not either or. And so I like to ask my friends who think it's either or, like, what other relationship with another human being do you have that's that black and white? This stuff is complicated. It's complex. It takes nuance, and that's what's happening in Youngstown, and I think it's a good example of what can happen around the country if you, in older areas where we don't have the local tax base that we used to have the federal government come in, and you should see the ripple effect already happening. And it's a beautiful thing, but it takes that kind of comprehensive plan.
Mr. Higgins?
Well, I was just going to mention where Tim was talking about infrastructure, the New America Foundation has a study out called The Way Forward, and they propose spending $1.2 trillion on infrastructure, primarily because of the reasons that we stated here. Money is as cheap as it's ever going to be, labor's cheap, and equipment is cheap. But they further explain that it will create 25 million jobs over the next 5 years. 5 million the first year, reducing the unemployment rate from its current rate to 6.4%. 5 million in the second year, reducing the unemployment rate further to 5.4%. These are proven growth vehicles, and that's exactly what the economy does. And it'll also put people back to work. You know, all the construction trades, to their considerable credit, have a program called Helmets to Hard Hats, where they take veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, they expedite their apprenticeship training and put them to work, making $60,000, $70,000 a year. You really want to say thank you for your service on behalf of a grateful nation? Put them to work rebuilding this nation. You know, we will spend, the federal government, in transportation infrastructure this year, $53 billion. It's a disgrace. We're a nation of 300 million people. You just spent, as a nation, the United States, $89 billion rebuilding the roads and bridges of Afghanistan. You just spent $69 billion rebuilding the roads and bridges of Iraq. Those are nations of 30 and 26 million respectively. But for a nation of 300 million people, you're going to spend $53 billion.
And you look at what our top competitors are spending as a percentage of their GDP. I think we're at 1% of our GDP that we spend on infrastructure. It maybe went up to 2 during this recovery package. But if you look at India and China, it's 7 or 8% of their GDP. Now, granted, they're still developing in so many different ways, but for us to be at 1 and they're at 6, 7, or 8, how are we going to be able to keep up when our infrastructure is so much older? It's time to rebuild America. And I don't know anybody in my district, Democrat or Republican, who's really not for that. And I've had Republican friends of mine say, the light bulb goes off and say, wait a minute, we're going to have to do this at some point, and we got a high unemployment rate, and we got low interest rates. This doesn't make any sense to put it off.
If not now, when?
When?
When are we going to do it? We can do these things. We can do the wind turbines for the clean energy, as Mr. Delaney was talking about, solar panels, and of course the transportation systems, which we're discussing here.
Well, as you said, too, excuse me, you got to ship that stuff. That stuff needs shipped. It needs manufactured, and then it needs shipped somewhere on a road and over bridges and ports and airports and logistics facilities and everything else. You got to make that investment, and that'll grease the wheels of the commerce.
George Washington and Alexander Hamilton at the very start of this nation said, build the infrastructure.
We need them back here. We need them back here.
We can use that again. Well, the President has put it out there, too.
Sure.
In his State of the Union speech, he spoke very, very clearly to the advanced manufacturing centers that you talked about, Mr. Ryan. He talked about infrastructure. He's made proposals that have just been pushed aside by our Republican colleagues here. But there are proposals that would grow this economy, give us the foundation upon which we can then have additional growth. I see that the representative from the city of Washington, the District of Washington, is here. Ms. Norton, thank you very much for joining us. Gentlemen, thank you very much for this evening. Eleanor Holmes Norton, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
I want to thank my good colleague from California for keeping before the Congress the notion of not only making it in America, but making some jobs here. You were just talking about infrastructure. Infrastructure is all made in America if we make sure that we don't build bridges, for example, from materials from China. But when it comes to the roads, when it comes to the cement, we don't get those from abroad. We make those here, and that's why infrastructure has always been the foremost way to stimulate an economy. It's interesting that it stimulates not only the construction trades, but it's best because it stimulates other parts of the economy below it. It's the way to get everything going. I couldn't agree with you more in pointing up, and you and I on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, the importance of infrastructure. That used to be the great bipartisan issue of the Congress of the United States, and I think there is some chance that it will be again. We note that this Congress, the bill that we just passed the last Congress, the Surface Transportation Bill, will have to be renewed in next year, and I certainly hope that becomes an opportunity to do a surface transportation bill for more than 2 years, and that's where we have to get to work right now. But I wanted to come to say to my friend, because I was so pleased that he was on the floor today, in particular the time that the Ryan budget has come forward. And I note the very good news, the 246,000 jobs that the private sector on its own, with no help from the public sector and no help from the Congress, has come forward with, cheering all of us up. But Mr. Speaker, I do want to note that we are about to countermand all that the private sector is doing alone. And the reason is that the federal and the state sectors are doing just the opposite. They are reducing spending. The states and the cities are causing layoffs, and the result is that for every job that the private sector makes, we are moving in exactly the opposite direction because all oars are not in the water. If you're trying to bring growth, and thank goodness we have a private sector that is beginning to say we won't wait for the other oars, the private and the state oar, we're going in now, the rest of you should join us. The very least we should do, however, is to make it worse for the private sector to keep doing what it's doing. Sequester, of course, will do that. The markets have not reacted yet, but there is no way in which people in the private sectors, particularly small businesses, are going to continue to add jobs as they see that the federal and state governments are doing just the opposite. And the reason the state governments are doing that is because when we make cuts, that passes through directly to them. So they're trying to protect themselves because they must have a balanced budget. Since they must have a balanced budget, they are making cuts every single day, or at least reducing spending. And the Ryan budget comes forward, and in a real sense, it looks a lot like it's always looked. But look what it does. It makes half of its so-called savings from health care, Medicare, Medicaid, and of all things, the Affordable Health Care Act. I guess a budget ought to be, we ought to say a budget is what indeed it always has been. It's what you hope. It's a hope-for document. I hope that we don't get the Ryan budget, but I cannot believe that Mr. Ryan believes that at this late date, with an election already taking place, with the benefits of the Affordable Health Care Act flowing every day, that we're about to repeal that. Half of its savings, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Health Care Act, and he caps food stamps. I want to say to my good friend from California, I think we ought to stop slapping the private sector in the face every time it makes jobs, making sure that we do cuts that take away the effects of those jobs. That's what we're doing. We talk about the way, and I note that you have one of the posters that show how we hurt people. We ought to also understand we hurt people and we hurt the economy at the same time, and that's why CBO says 700,000 jobs are at risk because of the sequester alone. Leave aside what the Ryan budget will do.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Norton, and for your years of service here. You were just moving to the Ryan budget, which I suspect he'll introduce maybe the next day or two. This is the same old, but this time it's worse than the old. He's talking about an austerity budget, a very stringent austerity budget on steroids that will clearly decimate the economy as those cuts are made. You just said the federal government makes a reduction. It comes right down to cities and states laying people off. And we've had this growth this last month, 274,000 jobs, 247,000 jobs. And here we go. Let's understand what is being discussed by Mr. Ryan. Who are these people on Medicaid? And he proposes to cut Medicaid by 1/3 and block grant it to the states, which means just give the states some money. But who are those people on Medicaid? Now, we call it Medi-Cal in California, but you can see that 2/3 of the Medicaid money goes to seniors and disabled. So, Mr. Ryan, what are you doing? Who exactly are you pointing out for the reductions? You're going after seniors and the disabled.
I think that point you just made about Medicaid needs to be said again. People think of Medicaid as somehow poor people will let them fend for themselves. It turns out that almost all of the funds, 2/3, go to seniors and disabled people. We're targeting the wrong people.
They think it's welfare. Well, these are seniors and disabled people that can't work, or people that are retired. Now, so what does it mean? It slashes that budget for seniors that provide them with nursing homes, principally. These folks are in nursing homes. So you're going to take 1/3 of the money out of nursing homes. Now, just what are those seniors going to do? What are they going to do? You're taking a third of the money out by 2022. You mentioned Medicare. Oh yeah, Medicare. Mr. Ryan proposes to end Medicare as we know it. He's going to give seniors a voucher. Well, they can stay on Medicare, but they have a voucher to buy Medicare. The guarantee of affordable health care, quality health care for seniors terminates with the Ryan Republican budget. Who are those people on Medicare? Well, let's see. About 3% earn over $100,000 a year. 1% somewhere around 90 to 100. But down here, here's where the Medicare beneficiaries are. They're earning somewhere $10,000 to $20,000 or $30,000 right here. 28, 20, 16. You're getting up to 50%. Right there, people below 40% or $40,000. These are not wealthy people. Medicare is there to provide people with the ability to have quality health care in their retirement years. But Mr. Ryan would end that and give them a voucher and shift the cost to the individuals who would then have to go out and buy private health insurance. I was insurance commissioner in California for 8 years, and I understand what the private insurance companies are all about. The private health insurance companies are all about their bottom line profit. It's not people, it's profit. And if that's what Mr. Ryan wants to do, we're going to fight vigorously and successfully to say, no, no. The promise of Medicare is here to stay.
Well, isn't that, by the way, exactly how we got Medicare? That seniors were left to the private market, and finally the Congress understood that the private market cannot accommodate people with that 22 or 28% income.
No. Exactly right. When I was young, before Medicare, my dad, we lived in a rural community. There was a county hospital. My dad took me to the county hospital to visit the rancher who was on the, we were ranchers. On the other side of the hill was another rancher that was elderly and was at the county hospital. I will remember forever my life going to that ward with maybe 15, 20 elderly people side by side in beds. The stench, the care was almost non-existent. Poverty was everywhere. It was worse than horrible. But in 1964, this nation did something very, very important. Together with Social Security, they brought seniors out of poverty because it was the medical expenses that forced them into poverty. So Medicare brought seniors out of poverty, and it went from, I don't know, I think it was almost 80% of seniors were in poverty to a situation today where maybe 8 to 10% are in poverty. Social Security and Medicare, absolutely critical.
And Medicaid.
And any attempt to change that goes right to the heart of our value as Americans. We will take care of our seniors. That's not to say changes are not possible. Of course changes ought to be possible. For example, we ought to be negotiating with the drug companies over the price of prescription drugs. But oh no, when the prescription drug benefit was passed, added into and signed by George W. Bush was a paragraph that said the federal government is a price taker. It cannot negotiate the price of drugs. So we spend billions and billions where it's not necessary.
And, of course, there are some agencies that do negotiate the price of drugs. And just
Exactly. Exactly.
I do want to point out that when you talk about the transfer of the expense, the cost of Medicare to seniors themselves, the cost we know they couldn't possibly bear. Notice that your hopes got up when Mitt Romney said during the campaign that we should reduce the loopholes. Well, note what Mr. Ryan does. He reduces the loopholes in order to give rich folks a further tax reduction. So where does the money go? Where their top rate now is 39.6%. Well, he wants to bring their top rate down to 25%. So he wants to close the loopholes, all right. I'm not sure which ones he has in mind, but they would go back into the same 1% sector that already has gotten all the benefit from tax cuts until what we finally did in January, when others got some relief as well.
I'm going to pick up another chart. The issue you raised is one that we really ought to chart. Let me go get another chart. Just keep going there a second.
Yeah, I'm very glad my good friend from California does have a way to illustrate all of these points. Not only does he reduce the top rate from 39.6, that's how much the very richest would pay, to 25%, but you may say, well, but he's got a 10% rate in there essentially for everybody else. Well, if everybody else paid 10% and the very richest paid 25%, there would be no revenue for the federal government. So all we're saying about Medicare and Medicaid would mean that there would be no revenue to fund them, and that seems to be his point. Get so little revenue coming into the federal government that in and of itself will mean you have to do the cuts, and you'll get rid of these programs that we have been building for 50 years.
I ran over and got this chart. I wasn't going to talk about this evening, but you brought the issue up about where the money has gone and the issue of tax breaks. This chart begins in 1979, and it shows the basic growth in income. So it starts down here in 79, and this is the bottom 20% have really seen maybe very, very little growth in their income. The next 20%, a little better, and this is the next quartile. These are the 1%ers. We talked about the 99%. This is the 99% down here. These are the 1%ers. These are the people that have seen extraordinary income growth. And it just happens to coincide right here, this income growth has coincided with the Bush tax cuts in the early 2000s. So we've seen this enormous percentage income, almost a 300% income, 277% growth in their income, so that you're beginning to see the skewing of wealth in America. This is the annual income, but if you take a look at wealth and you put another chart of wealth here, you'll see something very same. So the rich get richer and the poor stay where they are. That old song. And here we are. This is a result of multiple effects, but one of the principal ones is tax policy. And if Mr. Ryan's budget passes, as you have suggested, then the top tax rate goes from 39 to 25%, which means that those who already have a lot will get a whole lot more. And I'm reminded of a quote by Mr. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, and he said, it's not, this is a paraphrase, I wish I had it with me to be exact. He said, we're not measured by how much those who have get more, but rather by what we do for those who have little. And this is our great challenge. This is where the great buying power of America should be, in the bottom 99%, really in the bottom 50 or 60%. I thank you for raising that point about the tax policy and the Ryan budget, but it'll make this line just continue to grow like that, and the rest, because of the elimination of the deductions, and are going to see a stalling of their income.
So he does get balance within 10 years, and look at how he gets it. You still do not have anything like a contribution, a real contribution from those who have benefited the most from the tax cuts that built up that chart you're talking about. It continues to come from the lowest part of the income stream, income groups in the United States. I don't know when people will let the Congress know they're not going to take it anymore, but it seems to me the time has come, because frankly I was encouraged by the fact, I hope this pans out, that the President reached out to at least some senators to see whether or not there's somebody somewhere, and since the Democrats controlled the House, that perhaps we could get to a greater balance by bringing more people into the equation. The Republicans are fond of saying you can't spin yourself into prosperity. Well, you can't cut yourself into prosperity either. That's why the notion of balance makes the most sense. That's why the President was elected, because that apparently made the most sense to the American people.
Well, exactly. The President has proposed a balanced approach to sequestration as well as to the long-term deficit plan, a combination of additional revenues, many of them from closing loopholes, and also some very wise cuts. There are things that can be done in Medicare. I talked earlier about the prescription drug benefit, but there's also the way in which Medicare is organized. The fee-for-service system encourages additional and often unnecessary procedures. There's a lot of fraud in the system. We need to deal with that. And the Affordable Health Care Act, interestingly enough, went right after every one of those. And yet they want to repeal the Affordable Health Care Act. What are they thinking? We know the Affordable Health Care Act works. We know that the inflation rate in Medicare since the Affordable Health Care Act went into effect has dropped precipitously. It's still growing, but it's growing slower than the general health care inflation rate in the nation.
And that's the first time we've seen that in decades.
In decades, in decades. But we're seeing the changes. The Affordable Health Care Act, a major part of it is an annual well-person visit to the doctor. So critically important. Why? What's your blood pressure? How's your sugar? What's happening in your life? Can we prevent you from getting diabetes? Can we give you some cheap pills to keep your blood pressure down, or are we going to have the blood pressure go up so you get a stroke and pay big time for years and years with disabilities and medical care? So the Affordable Health Care Act has the right incentives in it to bend the cost curve, and it is. It's actually working.
It's working, and because it's working, we know good and well that the last thing the American people would approve is snatching it back, particularly since by 2014 it's going to reach everybody. I agree with you. There are ways to cut, and unlike my friends on the other side, this side has never said no cuts. Just like their view is only spending. We have never had that view, only this or that. We really are open to the kind of negotiation, tough negotiation it's going to take to come out with something. Now, I'll say for the Ryan budget, if he says he was questioned about whether you really think any of this is going to happen, and he said words to the effect, well, you've got to put down what you really want. I don't have any problem with that if they come to the table this time so that there can be a real negotiation and we can get to the kind of budget that I think really is doable.
I notice that our time is nearly over. If you'd like a few closing comments, I'm going to end in just a few moments, too.
Well, first I want to thank my friend for keeping the jobs before us. And at the bottom line, that's really what we've been talking about, even as we talk about the Ryan budget. I simply wanted to come forward because when I heard you on the floor, it seemed to me almost everything you were saying fed into the news today from the Ryan budget. And I ask people to try to follow the explanation of what that budget does when you hear that he can close the budget in 10 years rather than 25 years. Understand that that is impossible if you want to grow this economy. And may I thank you once again, my good friend from California, for making all the important points this evening.
From Washington, D.C., your leadership in this community has been known for some time. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. I want to do two things before I end. First of all, Medicare is back on the table. The Ryan budget takes up Medicare once again and provides a voucher which will basically destroy it. I used this last time around. I'm going to change this. It says Medicare 1965, that was President Johnson, until 2013. Created by LBJ, destroyed by the GOP? I don't think so. Seniors don't want it. Americans don't want it. The last campaign for presidency, this is one of the major issues, and yet Mr. Ryan's coming back with it. Bad idea, bad timing. And I want to end with this. This is a great country. There is no other place in the world like the United States. It is one terrific country. There's enormous energy in this country, energy where people want to get a job, they want to go to work, businesses want to grow, they want to hire people. All of that is waiting for Congress to get its act together, to get this sequestration out of the way, which is an austerity budget that has 750,000 jobs to be lost in it. Get that out of the way. Look at a balanced proposal as the President has suggested. End some tax loopholes, make some cuts, make wise, thoughtful cuts, and it's possible, it can be done, and it should be done. And along the way, we can grow the economy. We can once again make it in America, because when we make things in America, when we use our tax money to buy American-made equipment and supplies and products, we're creating jobs here. We're putting people back to work. George Washington said we ought to do it. Alexander Hamilton, his Treasury Secretary, said we ought to do it. And we, the Democrats, say we ought to do this. We ought to have a Buy American. Mr. Rahal, the ranking member of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, has made it clear that as a major part of the new transportation bill, there's going to be a major Make It in America component so that we're buying American-made goods once again. And he's supported by every one of the ranking members of every subcommittee. And I add myself to that list. For the last 3 years, I've carried specific bills that our tax money, transportation tax money, would be used to buy American trucks and buses and bridges and steel made here in America. And if you're going to put up a solar panel on your house or a wind turbine and you expect a subsidy, and you should have one, then it should be an American-made solar panel or wind turbine. We can make it in America when Americans once again make it. So that's our message. Our message is to be wise about the cuts. Yes, we're going to make cuts. Balance it with appropriate revenue increases, which would be basically the elimination of many of the unnecessary subsidies that go out, even to American corporations still receiving subsidies for offshoring jobs. No more. The President was right. Give a break to American companies that bring jobs back to the United States. All of this is possible. This is what we are here for, 435 of us in the House of Representatives, to set policy. Mr. Delaney talked about education, technology, energy policy, and we were joined this evening by our other friends, Mr. Higgins from New York and Mr. Ryan from Ohio and Ms. Norton from Washington, D.C. It's been a good evening. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time, and thank you.
The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion.
Yes, sir. The question is on the motion to adjourn.
That's my motion. To adjourn.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. for morning hour debate.